The briefing room fell silent. December 9, 1944, 3rd Army headquarters somewhere in France. Outside, snow had started falling. Inside, Colonel Oscar Koch stood at the mapboard, pointer in hand, facing a room full of officers who thought the war was almost over. Koch cleared his throat. His voice was quiet, measured, the kind that made you lean forward to hear properly. Gentlemen, I believe the Germans are preparing a major counteroffensive, possibly through the Ardennes. Soon. Someone laughed. Not loudly, but enough. Another officer shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Everyone knew Germany was beaten. Hitler was out of fuel, out of men, out of options. The idea of a large-scale attack through frozen forests seemed absurd. 3rd Army was preparing to push east into Germany. Christmas leave was being discussed. The end felt close. But General George Patton didn't laugh. He stared at Koch across the room, then stood and walked to the map. Show me. What happened next would save thousands of American lives. Not through dramatic heroics or brilliant tactics on the battlefield, but through something simpler and infinitely harder. A general who listened to the one man willing to tell him an uncomfortable truth. And speaking of decisions, here's one that's way easier. Hit that subscribe button to support storytelling that digs into the details. Now, to understand how these two men ended up in that room, trusting each other when almost no one else believed, we need to go back. Oscar Koch wasn't born for the spotlight. Milwaukee, 1897. He joined the Wisconsin National Guard as a private, worked his way up through World War I. By World War II, he'd made intelligence work his specialty, a field most officers considered boring paperwork. Intelligence in the 1940s meant prisoner interrogations, aerial photos, fragmentary radio intercepts, reports from resistance fighters who might or might not be reliable. Koch's job was assembling scattered pieces into something useful. Reading between the lines. Seeing patterns where others saw noise. He learned early that the most dangerous assumption was comfort. When everyone agreed the enemy couldn't do something, that's when you should worry. George Patton was everything Koch wasn't. Born Loud in California, 1885. West Point graduate, Olympic competitor, tank commander in World War I. By 1944, already a legend. Brilliant, profane, theatrical, impossible to ignore. He wore ivory-handled pistols, gave speeches that would make sailors blush, believed in reincarnation. But Patton had a quality rarer than courage. He listened to people who knew things he didn't. From North Africa through Sicily to France, Koch served as his G2, his intelligence chief. They formed a partnership. Patton trusted Koch because Koch never told him what he wanted to hear. Koch trusted Patton because unlike many generals who buried uncomfortable intelligence, Patton read it and acted. By December 1944, they'd worked together over 2 years. Koch knew when Patton was genuinely asking versus testing his staff. Patton knew that when Koch spoke carefully, choosing his words, it meant something didn't fit the obvious pattern. The autumn of 1944 felt like victory. After the Normandy breakout, 3rd Army had exploded across France. By early December, they'd crossed into Germany. Intelligence estimates suggested Germany had little capacity for large offensives. Officers were planning occupation duty. Some hoped the war would end before Christmas. But Koch was uneasy. Late at night, he went through reports that didn't make sense. Prisoner interrogations mentioned divisions that shouldn't exist. Radio intercepts showed increased German signals traffic in quiet areas. Aerial photos showed trains moving west, supply dumps being built, roads repaired where no major German force should be operating. Koch marked every anomaly on maps, unit movements, logistics buildups, prisoner reports, radio traffic. Slowly, a picture formed. The Germans weren't collapsing. They were regrouping, armor, infantry, artillery, opposite the Ardennes. The Ardennes was forested, hilly terrain on the Belgian-German border. The American line there was held thinly by resting units. Most commanders considered it unlikely for a major German attack. Koch looked at it differently. He didn't ask what made strategic sense. He asked what the evidence showed. And the evidence showed German forces concentrating opposite a weak section during winter, when weather would ground Allied air power. Koch's training told him to assess enemy capabilities, not intentions. The question wasn't, will Hitler try something desperate? But can he? The answer was yes. Hitler could scrape together enough force for one last gamble. Born of desperation, but desperate men are the most dangerous. Koch finished his analysis. He prepared his briefing. And on December 9th, he walked into Patton's office knowing what he was about to say would sound like paranoia to almost everyone in the room. Patton listened without interrupting. He leaned over the map table as Koch walked him through the indicators, the missing divisions, the logistical build-up, the suspicious quiet on parts of the front. When Koch finished, Patton asked questions. How sure are you? Where exactly would they hit? What's their objective? Koch answered honestly. I cannot be certain, sir. But the capability is there. The conditions favor it. Surprise. Whether that grounds our air support, a weak section of our line. If they're going to try anything, it'll be soon. Other officers shifted uncomfortably. One suggested Koch might be overinterpreting limited data. Another pointed out higher headquarters didn't share this assessment. Patton raised his hand for silence. He looked at Koch, then the map. This was the moment when command decisions get made, not on battlefields, but in quiet rooms where a general decides whether to trust the quiet voice that contradicts everyone else. If you're right and we do nothing, Patton said, we lose men. If you're wrong and we prepare, we lose some time and effort. He straightened. Draw up contingency plans. If the Germans hit the Ardennes, I want Third Army ready to pivot north and hit them in the flank. Not in a week. In days. The staff stared. Turn an entire army 90 degrees in winter based on a possibility most thought unlikely? But Patton's tone left no room for argument. Over the following days, staff officers at Third Army headquarters worked late into the night. They drafted movement orders. They calculated fuel requirements, supply routes, assembly areas. They redrew maps with arrows pointing north instead of east. Most of them thought this would never be used, that it was just another example of Patton's aggressive imagination. But the plans were ready. The clock was ticking. December 16, 1944. Just before dawn. Along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest, German artillery opened fire. Thousands of shells fell on American positions. In the darkness and fog, German infantry and armored columns surged forward. They hit thinly held sections of the line. Units were overrun. Communications cut. Chaos spread like fire. By midday, reports flooded into Allied headquarters. Massive German attack. Multiple breakthroughs. American units falling back or surrounded. At Supreme Headquarters, the shock was profound. This wasn't supposed to happen. Intelligence estimates had said Germany lacked the capability. But here it was, a full-scale winter offensive, the largest German attack in the West since 1940. Historians would later call it an intelligence failure. But at Third Army headquarters, there was no shock. Patton looked at Koch. No triumph in that look. No, I told you so. Only grim recognition. Koch was right. Quick aside before we continue. If you're tired of AI-generated history and want real research with actual archival footage, the membership link is below. We're historians, not robots. Anyway, within hours, Patton was on the phone with Eisenhower. On December 19th, Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun. Senior Allied commanders gathered to plan a response. The situation was dire. German forces had penetrated deep into Allied lines, creating a dangerous bulge. American units were surrounded at Bastogne, a critical road junction. The Germans were driving toward the Meuse River. Eisenhower asked Patton how quickly Third Army could disengage from its current positions and strike north into the German flank. The answer stunned everyone in the room. 48 hours, sir. 3 divisions. It sounded impossible. Armies don't turn on a dime. Logistics, coordination, winter weather, these things take time. But Patton's staff already had the plans. The fuel was allocated. The routes were mapped. The orders were drafted. All they had to do was issue them. Thanks to Koch's warning and Patton's willingness to listen, Third Army had been preparing for this moment for over a week. Imagine you're a soldier in one of those divisions. You've been fighting for months, looking forward to rest. Then midnight orders. Pack up, move north. No explanation. You climb into a truck. The canvas barely blocks the wind. Roads are slick with ice. Convoys stretch for miles in darkness. You don't know where you're going, only that men ahead are in trouble. It's brutal, exhausting. But it works. In under 3 days, Third Army covers over 100 miles, pivots 90 degrees, and hits the German flank. On December 26, lead elements break through to Bastogne, relieving the encircled paratroopers. The German offensive begins collapsing. By late January, the Bulge is erased. Germans have lost irreplaceable resources. The war continues for months, but the outcome is certain. Thousands of American soldiers survive because one analyst saw the storm coming and one general listened. Oscar Koch doesn't appear in the photographs of the Bastogne relief. He doesn't give press conferences. His name doesn't appear in headlines. He's back at Third Army headquarters in the same corner, updating maps, reading reports, tracking the shrinking red symbols that represent German units. After the war, historians write about the Battle of the Bulge. Many call it an intelligence failure. They ask how the Allies missed the signs. Koch knows the answer. The signs were there. The information existed. The failure wasn't in collection. It was in evaluation, in belief, in the courage to act on uncomfortable truth. In the late 1960s, Koch works with journalist Robert Allen to write a book, G2, Intelligence for Patton. In it, he lays out his methods, his philosophy, his account of the weeks before the Bulge. He's sometimes called Patton's oracle, the man who saw the future when others were blind. But Koch doesn't see himself as a prophet. He sees himself as someone who did his job, looked at the evidence, judged enemy capabilities honestly, and warned the people who needed to know. The tragedy, he reflects quietly in later years, is not that intelligence officers failed to see the German build-up. Several did. First Army's G2 saw it. SHAEF intelligence officer Kenneth Strong saw it. The tragedy is that so few commanders were willing to listen. Patton was the exception. Every decision could mean survival or annihilation. Koch's analysis and Patton's trust literally changed the outcome. Your decision is easier. Hit subscribe to keep these deep dives coming. After the war, Patton's legend only grows. The aggressive general who raced across Europe, who gave profane speeches, who believed in past lives as a warrior. He dies in December 1945 in a car accident in Germany, just months after the war ends. He's buried among his soldiers. Koch lives a quieter life. He retires, writes, reflects. He's honored by those who understand intelligence work, but remains largely unknown to the public. And yet in the story of the Battle of the Bulge, these two men are inseparable. Patton's boldness meant nothing without Koch's foresight. Koch's analysis meant nothing without a commander willing to trust it and act. Together, they saved lives. Here's what makes this story matter. It's about the courage to speak uncomfortable truth, and the greater courage to listen. Think about every organization you've been part of. There's always someone like Patton, loud, confident, driving forward. And someone like Koch, quiet, careful, seeing patterns others miss. Wars are won or lost depending on whether the loud person listens to the quiet one. Companies rise or collapse based on whether executives hear analysts who say the numbers don't add up. Families survive or fracture based on whether someone listens when a voice says we need to talk. In December 1944, Patton could have dismissed Koch's warning. Intelligence was incomplete. Higher headquarters disagreed. His army was positioned for attack east. Christmas was coming. The comfortable assumption was that Germany was beaten. But Patton understood something fundamental. Being in charge doesn't mean having all the answers. It means being smart enough to listen to people who know things you don't. Koch had earned his trust through 2 years of being right when it mattered. That's not blind faith. That's professional respect built on demonstrated competence. Koch didn't cry wolf. He didn't see threats everywhere. When he said, we need to prepare for this, it was because the evidence demanded it. And Patton had learned that ignoring Koch's warnings was more dangerous than acting on them. The moral courage this required from both men is staggering. Koch had to stand in front of a room full of skeptical officers and predict disaster when everyone else was optimistic. He had to stick to his analysis knowing he might be wrong, knowing he'd look foolish if December 16th came and nothing happened. That takes guts, not battlefield courage, but the courage to trust your judgment when almost no one else does. Patton had to make contingency plans that looked paranoid. He had to divert staff effort and resources away from his planned offensive based on a possibility his superiors didn't believe. If Koch was wrong, Patton would have looked like he'd lost his nerve, distracted by phantom threats. But he did it anyway because professional trust meant more than pride. And when December 16th came, that trust paid off in saved lives. Thousands of men walked out of the Ardennes in January 1945 because one general listened to one intelligence officer. How many people in how many situations have died or suffered because the person in charge refused to believe the quiet voice saying danger is coming? This isn't ancient history. This is every boardroom where the junior analyst sees the warning signs but stays quiet because no one wants to hear it. Every family where someone notices the problem but doesn't speak up because it'll cause conflict. Every team where the data says one thing but momentum carries everyone in the opposite direction. The question is always the same. When the quiet voice speaks, will anyone listen before it's too late? George Patton was a great general. Aggressive, innovative, sometimes brilliant. But his greatest act may not have been a battle. It may have been the moment he looked at a quiet man with a stack of reports and said, "I believe you. Let's prepare." That decision, made in a briefing room in early December with no guarantee it was right, saved thousands of lives. And Oscar Koch's legacy isn't in headlines or monuments. It's in the men who came home. Who grew old. Who had children and grandchildren. Because one analyst refused to tell his commander what he wanted to hear and instead told him what he needed to know. For the full unfiltered version of stories like this, with all the details and archival footage we can't show here, check out the membership link below. That's the weight of responsibility. That's the cost of courage. And that's the question this story leaves long after the details fade. In your life, when the quiet voice speaks, when someone who knows something you don't tries to warn you, will you listen? Or will you wait until the storm is already here? December 9th, 1944. A briefing room in France. A quiet colonel stands at a map board and predicts the impossible. A loud general listens. And a week later, when the German artillery opens fire in the Ardennes, thousands of American soldiers survive because two men trusted each other when no one else would. The partnership between Koch and Patton didn't prevent the Battle of the Bulge. But it saved the response. It turned potential catastrophe into eventual victory. It proved that the best command relationships aren't about agreement. They're about trust, competence, and the courage to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable. Koch died in 1970, inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame in 1993. Patton died in 1945, buried among the soldiers he led. But their legacy lives in every commander who listens to the expert in the corner, every leader who values uncomfortable truth over comfortable certainty, every person who understands that sometimes the most important courage is the courage to be wrong and the wisdom to prepare anyway. That's not just military history. That's the difference between catastrophe and survival in any field, any time, any challenge where getting it right matters more than looking right. And on December 16, 1944, when German shells began falling on American positions in the Ardennes, it made all the difference.